Have you ever stopped in the middle of an ordinary day and felt a quiet strangeness, as if you were looking at your own life from a distance and wondering whether what you are living now is truly yours? Not the life you chose in a moment of fear or pressure, not the life shaped by expectations you absorbed before you were old enough to question them, but something deeper, something that has been waiting, patient and silent, beneath every role you have ever played, beneath every version of yourself you have offered to the world in the hope that it would be enough. There is a question that Carl Jung believed most people never dare to ask directly, not because they are afraid of the answer, but because they are afraid of what asking might cost them. That question is this: who were you before the world told you who to be? And what would it mean to return to that person, not as an act of nostalgia or escape, but as the most serious and necessary work of your life? What Jung discovered over decades of working with the deepest layers of the human psyche is something that may surprise you. The answer is not hidden in your achievements, not buried in your failures, not locked inside the relationships you have built or broken over the years. The answer is encoded in something far more ancient, far more intimate, and far more overlooked than any of those things. It is written in the moment you arrived in this world, the season that received you, the month that first held you, the particular alignment of light and darkness, warmth and cold, abundance and scarcity that formed the invisible atmosphere of your very first days in this life. This is not astrology. This is not a belief system asking you to follow the stars or surrender your will to the position of celestial bodies. This is depth psychology. This is Carl Jung's understanding that the psyche is not formed in isolation from the world it enters, that the unconscious is shaped by more than just family dynamics and personal history, that the season of your birth leaves a psychological imprint so deep, so early and so quiet that most people live their entire lives without ever recognizing it. Yet it influences, in ways both subtle and profound, the way you seek connection, the way you handle solitude, the way you face darkness, the way you come alive. If you have ever felt a strange sense of timing in your life, a feeling that certain seasons stir something in you that you cannot fully explain, if you have ever noticed that you are drawn to particular qualities of light, particular rhythms of the year, particular moods that return like old visitors even when the circumstances of your life have completely changed, this video may help you understand why. Stay until the end, because what you are about to encounter is not information about you from the outside. It is a recognition of something in you that has always been there, quietly organizing your experience, waiting to be seen. Number 1, the season of arrival and the shape of the unconscious. Carl Jung spent the greater part of his intellectual life investigating one central mystery of human experience. Why do people who have never met, who come from entirely different cultures and speak entirely different languages, dream in the same symbols? Why do the images that rise from the depths of one person's unconscious bear such a striking resemblance to the myths, rituals and sacred stories of civilizations they have never encountered, that existed thousands of years before they were born? His answer was the collective unconscious, that vast, shared reservoir of psychological material that underlies every individual human mind, populated by what he called archetypes, universal patterns of energy, image and meaning that are not learned through personal experience, but inherited through the long history of the human species. Not taught by any teacher, but awakened by the circumstances of a particular life. But here is what is less often discussed when people speak about Jung's work. He also recognized that while the collective unconscious is shared across all human beings, the way it is activated in any particular individual is not uniform. Every person enters life through a specific door, and that door, Jung believed, is shaped in part by the world that receives you at the very beginning. The quality of light in the first weeks of your life, the temperature of the air, the sounds outside the window, the particular biological and social rhythms of the world in that season. These are not trivial biographical details. They are the first language your nervous system learns before it has any capacity for words. They are the first texture of existence your psyche encounters before it has developed any categories, any comparisons, any defenses, any distance from raw experience. Modern research in developmental psychology and chronobiology has begun to confirm what Jung intuited through decades of careful clinical observation. The season of birth influences the early development of the nervous system in ways that persist into adult personality and behavior. Studies conducted at research institutions across Europe and North America have found measurable correlations between birth month and various aspects of temperament and psychological functioning, specifically in how the brain's neurotransmitter systems develop during the first weeks and months of life. The quantity and quality of light exposure available to the mother during pregnancy affects the developing child. The temperature of the environment influences early physiological rhythms. The viral and immunological landscape of a particular season shapes the developing nervous system during windows of particular sensitivity. These are not small effects lost in the noise of individual variation. They are real, consistent, and meaningful patterns that science is only beginning to map with precision. But Jung would not reduce this to neurotransmitters alone, and neither should we. He would say that the season is not merely a physical environment. It is a psychological one. It carries a particular emotional and archetypal atmosphere that the newly arrived psyche absorbs at a level deeper than any conscious processing. Winter is not just cold. Winter is a particular quality of interiority, of withdrawal, of waiting, of the world holding its breath before renewal. It is the atmosphere of what endures through conditions of scarcity. It is the particular texture of what is essential stripped of all that is merely decorative. Spring is not just warmth. Spring is the eruption of the previously dormant, the insistence of life against resistance, the particular courage of what was hidden suddenly choosing to be seen, regardless of whether the conditions are fully ready. Summer is not just brightness. Summer is abundance and exposure, the full extension of the self into the world, the season of maximum presence, of what was once interior becoming joyfully visible. Autumn is not just decline. Autumn is the wisdom of letting go, the beauty of things that are ending, the particular richness that only comes when something has fully matured and knows it is about to change. Each of these is an archetypal atmosphere, and the psyche that opens its eyes for the first time within one of these atmospheres absorbs it deeply, not as information to be processed and stored, but as feeling, as the first tone of existence, as the unconscious backdrop against which all later experience will be, without the person ever quite realizing it, unconsciously measured and compared. Jung wrote that the unconscious is not merely a dumping ground for what we have forgotten or repressed. It is an active, intelligent layer of the psyche that is always oriented toward wholeness, always working beneath the surface of conscious awareness to move the total person toward a more complete expression of what they potentially are. And the first imprinting it receives, the seasonal atmosphere of arrival, becomes one of the earliest templates through which it begins to organize reality. Not the only template, not an unchangeable destiny written in the stars or in the calendar, but a foundational psychological weather, a set of inner tendencies so early and so quiet that most people never recognize them as tendencies at all. They simply experience them as themselves, as the way things are, as reality. This is what we will explore together, not to give you a fixed label or a sophisticated horoscope, not to replace one set of limitations with another, but to offer you a lens through which to look more honestly and more compassionately at the rhythms that have always been moving through you, the ones you inherited from the season that first received you, and the ones you are still, even now, in the ongoing process of integrating into a more complete version of who you are becoming. Number 2, winter births and the psychology of depth. There is a particular quality of mind that certain people carry through their lives without ever having a name for it. A pull toward depth over surface, a preference for the essential over the decorative, for what is real over what is merely impressive, a tendency to go quiet in crowds and come alive in solitude, a feeling that most conversations skim the surface of what could be said, what could be known, what could be genuinely shared between two people who were truly willing to be honest with each other, and a private hunger, often never spoken aloud, for something more real, more unguarded, more true. If you were born in the winter months, between December and February, this quality may feel extraordinarily familiar to you, so familiar, in fact, that you may have never questioned whether it is a choice or simply who you are. Carl Jung wrote extensively about what he called the introverted attitude, not as a personality flaw or a social deficit, not as a problem to be fixed or a weakness to be overcome, but as a particular orientation of psychic energy, one directed primarily inward rather than outward. The winterborn psyche is often marked by this orientation from the very beginning, because it enters a world that is already practicing the ancient art of interiority. The world outside is quiet, contracted, held in reserve. Light is minimal. Life has drawn inward and downward into roots and seeds and the deep places beneath the frozen surface. And the psyche that opens for the first time in this atmosphere absorbs that quality into its earliest sense of what existence feels like, what it means to be alive. What kinds of experience are worth attending to? This does not mean that all people born in winter are introverts in the simplified social sense of that word, though many of them are, and though many of them spent years believing this was a flaw rather than an orientation. What it means at a deeper psychological level is that the winter-born unconscious tends to be naturally comfortable with depth, in a way that can be simultaneously a profound gift and a quietly carried burden. A gift because depth perception, the ability to sense what lies beneath the surface of things, beneath words and performances and social presentations, beneath the comfortable stories people tell about themselves and each other, is one of the most genuinely valuable capacities a human being can develop. The winterborn person often perceives layers of reality that others simply do not see, not because they are more intelligent, but because the structure of their attention goes naturally inward and downward, rather than outward and upward. A burden because the world does not always reward depth. It often rewards speed, brightness, performance, and the ability to project an image of confident capability. And the winterborn soul, with its pull toward the essential, its impatience with what is merely decorative, can spend years and sometimes decades feeling fundamentally out of step with a world that seems to prefer the brilliant surface to the complex interior. Jung would recognize in this a characteristic confrontation with what he called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything the psyche has been told it should not be, does not need to be, or is not allowed to be. For many winterborn people, the shadow contains precisely the qualities they were encouraged to suppress in order to function successfully in the brightly lit, socially performative, extroverted culture that surrounds them. Warmth, spontaneity, lightness, the capacity for uncomplicated joy, the ability to receive as well as give, the willingness to be seen without having prepared something profound to offer. These qualities do not disappear in the winterborn psyche. They go underground, where they wait, sometimes for decades, for an invitation to return. The psychological work for someone born in winter is rarely about becoming more capable of depth. That capacity is already present in abundance, sometimes in excess. The work is about integration, about allowing the bright and the warm and the spontaneous and the joyful to exist alongside the profound and the reserved. It is about learning to surface without feeling that something essential has been betrayed. It is about discovering that visibility does not necessarily mean shallowness, and that warmth does not require the sacrifice of everything that makes winter-born people who they are. If you were born in winter, the invitation from Jung's psychology is not to become someone else or to cure what is not in fact an illness. It is to integrate, to let the warmth you have kept underground begin to find expression in the world, to discover that the depth you carry naturally is not a wall between you and other people, but a gift you can bring to them fully and without apology when you are ready to bring it. Number 3. Spring births and the psychology of becoming. There are people who carry an almost electrical relationship with possibility, people who can feel the potential in a situation more vividly and more immediately than its current form, who are genuinely animated by beginnings, by the not yet formed, by the sense that something is on the verge of emergence, that just around the next corner there is a version of things more alive and more full than the version currently visible, who become deeply restless when life settles into routine, and who feel most alive precisely at the edge of something new. If you were born in the spring months, between March and May, this quality of living perpetually toward emergence, of feeling most yourself when something is about to begin, rather than when something has already been established, may be woven into the very earliest texture of your psychological life. Jung described a particular archetypal energy he identified as the Puer Aeternus in Latin, the eternal youth. And he was careful to explain that this is not simply about being young in chronological years or immature in emotional development. It is about a particular orientation of the psyche, one that is forever facing toward the future, toward the possible, toward the not yet arrived, toward the horizon that always seems to promise something the present moment has not quite delivered. The spring-born psyche often carries a particularly strong resonance with this energy because it enters a world that is, quite literally, in the dramatic process of becoming. Frozen things are thawing, often violently, with a sound like something breaking open rather than merely warming. Hidden things are pushing upward through cold and resistant ground, with a force that seems disproportionate to their size. What was entirely invisible just weeks ago is insisting on becoming real, on being seen, on taking up space in the world. And the psyche that first opens in this atmosphere absorbs something of that insistence into its deepest sense of what life is and what it is for. This can be an extraordinary and genuinely rare source of creative and visionary energy. The spring-born person often has a remarkable capacity for reinvention, for beginning again after endings that would defeat someone else, for approaching familiar situations with a freshness of perception that is genuinely unclouded by the accumulated weight of how things have always been done. They can be visionary in the truest and most useful sense of that word, able to see what does not yet exist and to feel its pull as though it were already real, already present, already waiting to be inhabited. But Jung would also draw careful attention to the shadow dimension of this orientation, the difficulty the spring-born psyche can have with endings, with the slower and less glamorous work of sustained commitment, with the patient labor of bringing something all the way to completion rather than leaving it at the exciting moment of its beginning. When every horizon seems more vivid and more alive than the ground beneath your feet, when the next beginning always seems to promise more than the current middle is delivering, it becomes genuinely difficult to remain with something long enough for it to reach its full maturity. The gift of seeing what could be can become, if left unexamined, a subtle but costly flight from what is. The psychological work for the spring-born is what Jung called the integration of the senex, the archetypal elder energy, the capacity for patience and sustained commitment, for honoring the slow rhythms of genuine maturation, for the willingness to be present through the unglamorous middle of things, not only through their exciting beginnings. This does not mean extinguishing the spring energy. It means marrying it to something equally real and equally necessary, the understanding that some of the most important things a human life can produce can only be given by time, by staying, by the willingness to be present through difficulty and monotony, and the long stretches between the exhilarating beginning and the satisfying completion. If you were born in spring, the invitation from Jung's psychology is not to become less alive to possibility or less energized by what is new and not yet formed. It is to discover that staying is not the death of possibility but its truest and deepest fulfillment, that the seed that insists on becoming must also accept without resentment the slow and invisible work of taking root. Number 4. Summer births and the psychology of the full self. Some people seem to have been born with an instinctive and completely natural capacity for presence, not just social ease, though that is often a part of it, but something more fundamental and more interior than social skill. A relationship with the world that is immediate, sensory, full and genuinely engaged. A tendency to be actually here, authentically engaged with what is in front of them, rather than lost in what was or what might be. People who seem to give and receive warmth with a naturalness that others find both deeply magnetic and sometimes quietly difficult to fully understand, because for those others this quality of easy, unconditional presence requires effort that the summer-born person seems never to have been required to learn. If you were born in the summer months, between June and August, this quality of full and immediate presence may be one of the most foundational textures of your entire psychological life. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the sensation function, one of the 4 primary psychological functions he identified as fundamental orientations through which the psyche relates to reality. The sensation function is the capacity to be genuinely and completely present to immediate experience, to what is actually here in this moment, through the body, through the senses, through direct encounter with reality, rather than through abstraction, interpretation, or anticipation. Summer is the season of maximum presence, maximum light, maximum exposure of the world to itself and to others, and the psyche born into this atmosphere often carries a particularly strong and naturally developed capacity for this kind of fullness, for this kind of immediate and sensory engagement with what is actually here, rather than what might be or what was. This can be an immense and genuinely rare gift. The summer-born person often has a natural ability to enjoy life, to be present within it, to receive its pleasures and engage its challenges without the distance that psychological complexity can sometimes impose, in a way that people with other psychological orientations spend years trying to cultivate. They are often naturally generous, naturally engaged with others, naturally at home in the world of people and bodies and immediate shared experience. They do not typically struggle with presence. They inhabit it the way other people inhabit their breath, without effort, without thought, as the most natural thing in the world. But Jung would also illuminate the shadow dimension of this profound gift. The summer-born psyche, with its orientation toward the full and the present and the immediately engaging, can sometimes struggle with what lies beneath the surface of experience. With the parts of life that are not warm or bright, or easily shared or immediately resolvable. With depth that requires withdrawal rather than engagement. With darkness that requires sitting with what cannot be quickly fixed or socially processed. With the slower, more interior work of individuation that demands something quite different from the extroverted, world-engaged fullness that is the summer-born soul's most natural home. The work for the summer-born person is often about developing interiority, about discovering that there is a richness available in the quiet and the private and the unglamorous that is genuinely different from, but not inferior to the richness of full engagement with the world. Not to replace the gift of presence, but to deepen it, to add to it a quality of rootedness that makes the presence more than pleasurable, that makes it nourishing in a way that can sustain through the seasons of life that do not offer easy warmth. If you were born in summer, the invitation from Jung's psychology is to honor the fullness you naturally while also beginning to explore, with genuine curiosity rather than anxiety, what lies beneath it. To discover that interiority is not the absence of warmth, but its deepest and most enduring root. Number 5, autumn births and the psychology of maturity. There are people who seem to arrive in life already carrying a kind of seasoned awareness, not old before their time in a depleted or sorrowful way, but somehow possessed of an early understanding that things do not last forever, and that this is not only a tragedy to be mourned, but also, strangely and profoundly, a source of particular beauty that is unavailable to those who have not learned to see it. People who have a natural and somehow intimate relationship with endings, with what is passing, with the poignant mixture of fullness and loss that characterizes the most truthful moments of human experience. People who often feel most alive not in the bright, uncomplicated middle of things, but in the rich, complex, golden light of something reaching its full expression precisely because it knows it is about to change. If you were born in the autumn months, between September and November, this quality of seasoned and patient awareness may be one of the most distinctive and most undervalued gifts you carry. Jung wrote about a particular stage of the individuation process that he associated with the second half of life, a turning point at which the psyche, having spent the first half building the structures necessary for survival and participation in the social world, a workable persona, a professional identity, a set of relationships and responsibilities that constitute a life, begins to sense the insufficiency of those structures for the deeper question of meaning. This is the stage at which what was once entirely adequate no longer fully satisfies, at which the soul begins to ask not only what can I achieve, but what does any of this mean? Not only who do others need me to be, but who am I truly and essentially, at the level beneath all the roles I have learned to play with such convincing skill. The autumn-born psyche often has a particular and early affinity for this question, not because they are prematurely depleted or lacking in vitality, but because the season they were born into is already speaking this language with its entire being. Autumn is the time of the year when beauty and impermanence become genuinely inseparable from each other, when the world is simultaneously at its most visually vivid and most openly aware of its own transience. The autumn-born soul absorbs this dual awareness very early, often before they have any conceptual framework for understanding it or any language for communicating it to others. They often know, somewhere in their body, in the earliest layers of their felt sense of things, that nothing stays. And while this awareness can be a source of genuine and recurring melancholy, it is also, when it has been genuinely integrated rather than merely endured, one of the most powerful seeds of wisdom that a human being can carry through a lifetime. The shadow for the autumn-born, however, can be a tendency toward anticipatory grief, toward allowing the awareness of impermanence to shadow the present moment before it has even fully arrived or been appreciated. A tendency to hold back from full investment, from complete presence, from genuine and undefended attachment, because somewhere in the unconscious there runs an awareness, installed very early, that things end. And if you know that things will end, if you carry that knowledge in your body before you carry it in your mind, there can be a strong and understandable temptation to never quite fully begin. The work for the autumn-born is what Jung described as the genuine integration of the archetype of death and renewal. Not literal death, but the psychological capacity to allow things to end, to let endings be real and final without being annihilating, and to develop a deep and bodily trust that within every genuine ending there is already, invisibly, the seed of something that could not have come to be without it. If you were born in autumn, the invitation from Jung's psychology is to let the wisdom of impermanence deepen your presence rather than diminish it, to discover that the beauty you perceive in things precisely because you know they will end is most fully and most honestly honored, not by holding yourself at a careful distance from them, but by entering them as completely as you are capable of entering anything, because they will end, and because that ending is what makes the fullness of now both possible and necessary. Number 6. Integration. Your birth season is not your destiny. At this point in the journey we have been taking together, it is essential to say something that Carl Jung himself was always careful to emphasize, especially to those who encountered his ideas and were tempted to use them as a new and more sophisticated set of fixed categories for understanding themselves and others. Understanding the psychological imprint of your birth season is not the same as being defined by it. The goal of Jung's psychology was never to give people more refined labels to apply to themselves. The goal was always individuation, the ongoing, lifelong process of becoming more fully and more authentically oneself. A process that is by definition never finished and never fully captured by any category, however sophisticated. What the birth season offers is not a destiny but a starting point, a particular set of tendencies, capacities, vulnerabilities and strengths that are especially present and especially influential in the earliest layers of the psyche, because they were absorbed before the ego had any capacity for conscious choice or critical evaluation. They are the water you were first placed in, the temperature and quality of the world as it first received you. And like all early imprints, they shape you more than you know, precisely because they are so early and so foundational that they feel not like influences from outside but like you yourself. Like the way things simply are, the work of integration, which is the living heart of Jungian psychology, is the work of making these invisible patterns visible enough that you can enter into a conscious relationship with them. Not so that you can transcend them or escape them or replace them with something more socially acceptable, but so that you can choose your relationship to them, so that you can carry your tendencies consciously, rather than being unconsciously carried by them, so that what was given to you by the accident of timing, by the particular season the universe placed at the beginning of your story, can become something you actively inhabit and deliberately develop, rather than something that quietly shapes your choices while you believe you are making them freely. Jung believed deeply that the psyche is always oriented toward wholeness. Left to its own nature, without the distortions introduced by trauma, by social pressure, by the relentless demands of adaptation to a world that never quite fits any individual person perfectly, the psyche naturally moves toward a more complete expression of itself. The winter-born soul naturally develops a hunger for warmth to complement and complete its depth. The spring-born soul naturally begins to develop patience and staying power as it matures through repeated experience of what is lost by always leaving before things are finished. The summer-born soul naturally begins to sense the call of interiority as the years accumulate, and the question of inner life begins to press more urgently. The autumn-born soul naturally begins to trust presence even in the face of impermanence, discovering through experience that the fear of ending is not the same as the ending itself, and that what is fully lived, even if it does not last, leaves something in us that does. These movements toward wholeness are not imposed from outside by therapists or teachers or wisdom traditions. Though all of these can help, they arise from within the psyche's own nature, from its own quiet insistence on becoming complete. What gets in the way very often is not malice or weakness, but simply the unconscious identification with the early imprint, as though it were the final and complete word on who you are and can ever be. Your birth season gave you a genuine gift. And like all genuine gifts, it came with a corresponding challenge, a corresponding shadow, a corresponding dimension of unlived life that waits for integration. The work of your life, from a Jungian perspective, is not to maximize the gift at the expense of everything else, though the gift is real and should be honored. It is to find out what you become when the gift and the challenge are finally held together in a creative tension that allows both to be real simultaneously. Number 7. Living from your deepest rhythm, the return to yourself. We have traveled far together in this conversation, and we have arrived now at the place where everything we have explored must eventually find its landing point. Not in ideas, however resonant and compelling, but in the actual texture of a life being lived from day to day, in choices made in ordinary moments, in the practice of returning again and again to what is most genuinely true. Carl Jung, in his later years, spoke often about what he called the self, and he distinguished this carefully and repeatedly from the ego, the part of us that is conscious, that manages the practical details of daily existence, that interacts with the world and forms opinions about it, and presents it with a version of ourselves we have judged to be appropriate. The self, for Jung, was the larger and deeper totality of the psyche, including everything that was conscious and everything that had not yet become conscious, everything that had been developed through years of living, and everything that was still latent, still waiting for the conditions that would allow it to emerge, everything that was already present, and everything that was still quietly and persistently in the process of becoming. The self was not something to be constructed through effort or achieved through discipline, though both effort and discipline have their place in the psychological life. The self was something to be discovered, listened to over time, gradually and imperfectly aligned with. To live from the self, rather than purely from the ego, is to live in increasing alignment with your own deepest nature, rather than with the demands of the persona, with the requirements of social performance, with the fear of judgment or the hunger for validation from sources outside yourself. Living from your deepest rhythm, in Jung's understanding, means taking seriously the particular shape of your psychological life, including these earliest layers laid down by the season of your birth, and learning over time to work consciously with that shape, rather than unconsciously against it. It means recognizing that the tendencies you received from the season that first received you are not obstacles to be overcome, but materials to be worked with, the specific raw material from which, through the patient labor of a conscious life, something genuinely your own can be built. Think about what each season knows at the level of its deepest intelligence. Winter knows how to preserve, how to keep what is most essential alive and intact through conditions of genuine scarcity and genuine darkness, without drama and without complaint, simply by drawing everything inward and protecting what cannot afford to be lost. Spring knows how to begin again after what looked, from the outside, like a complete ending, how to push life upward through cold and resistant ground with a force that seems wildly disproportionate to the apparent fragility of what is doing the pushing. Summer knows how to give fully and without reservation, how to be genuinely present without the protective distance of self-consciousness, how to offer warmth and abundance, as though there were no question about whether there will be enough. Autumn knows how to release with genuine grace rather than desperate clinging, how to find beauty in what is passing and trust that every ending is also, invisibly, a preparation. These are not merely seasonal facts to be observed from the outside. They are psychological capacities, real and learnable dimensions of human experience, each of which your life will require of you at different moments. And each of us, regardless of which season first imprinted us, regardless of which capacity came most naturally and earliest, needs over the full course of a lifetime to develop access to all four of these ways of being in relationship with experience. The person who can only preserve, who can only protect and hold what has been carefully built, will struggle and sometimes break when life demands the raw courage and the forward motion of spring. The person who can only begin, who rushes with enthusiasm from possibility to possibility, without the willingness to remain through the middle, will miss the depth and the richness that only reveal themselves to those who stay long enough to find them. The person who can only give, who can only be fully present and warm and engaged with others, will be genuinely lost and genuinely frightened when life calls them inward, away from the social warmth that has always defined them. The person who can only release, who is so intimately familiar with endings that they have learned not to fully trust beginnings, will hold themselves back from the full richness of what life is continuously offering. Integration, which is not a destination you arrive at but a practice you return to, means becoming someone who has earned access to all four of these capacities, not equally and not without a dominant tone that reflects who you have genuinely always been and who you genuinely are, but broadly and deeply enough that no season of life, inner or outer, catches you completely unprepared, without any resources, with nothing in you that knows how to meet what has arrived. I want to close with something Jung wrote late in his life, when he had spent nearly 8 decades in intimate and often difficult relationship with both the extraordinary heights and the very real depths of human psychological experience. He wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you were told to be in the first years of your life, when you were too young and too dependent to question or resist, not who you decided to be in response to the early fears and early longings that shaped your first attempts at making a place for yourself in the world, but who you truly are. The full, complex, paradoxical, seasonally imprinted, shadow-carrying, capacity-rich, still-becoming person that you have always been moving toward being, through every experience that seemed at the time to be only an obstacle or only a gift. Your birth month is part of the story of who you are. Not the whole story, not the final chapter, not the only chapter that matters, but one of its earliest chapters, one written in the language of season and atmosphere and the particular quality of the world that first received you before you had any words for any of it, before you had any capacity to choose how to respond, before you had developed any defenses or any preferences or any ideas about who you were supposed to be. That early chapter does not determine what comes next, but understanding it, honestly and compassionately, and without either idealizing or dismissing what it gave you, offers you something genuinely valuable. A clearer sense of where you began, and therefore of the distance you have already traveled. A more honest and more generous recognition of what comes naturally to you, and what requires conscious and sustained cultivation. A deeper respect for the particular shape of your psychological life, with all its genuine strengths and all its unlived and still waiting possibilities. And from that deeper respect, slowly and not all at once, something begins to change. You begin to stop apologizing for the qualities that are most deeply and most authentically yours, the ones you were born into rather than chose. You begin to stop forcing yourself into shapes that were never designed for the particular form of your inner life, no matter how admirable those shapes might look on someone else. You begin to hear, beneath the noise of all the expectations and comparisons and performances that have filled the years of your life so efficiently, the quieter and more insistent voice of your own deepest rhythm, the one that was sounding even before you had ears to hear it, the one that has been sounding throughout every season of your life. Through every version of yourself you have offered the world, patient and continuous and waiting for you to stop long enough to recognize it as your own. Living from that rhythm is not a destination you reach and then inhabit permanently. It is a practice, a daily and sometimes hourly return, a repeated and never quite finished choice to listen more honestly to what is most true in you, rather than to what is most convenient, or most approved, or most admired by the world you are trying to live well within. Jung believed, and I believe he was right, that this choice, made again and again, in small moments and large ones, in the quiet ordinary decisions that no one else notices, and in the larger choices that shape the visible direction of a life, over years and decades and seasons that come and go and come again, is precisely what transforms a life from something that is merely adequate, merely functional, merely acceptable, into something that is genuinely, recognizably, unmistakably alive. You arrived in a particular season. That season gave you something real, something early, something woven into the structure of your psyche before you were old enough to know it was being given. And the rest of your life, every year of it, every season of it, every ordinary and extraordinary day of it, is the ongoing and never quite finished process of finding out what you will make of what was given, what you will offer back to the world from the full depth of all that you have received, all that you have learned, all that you have survived with your essential self still intact, and all that you are still, even now, in the most honest and most generous and most hopeful sense of the word, becoming. If something in this conversation touched something in you that rarely gets touched, if a particular season's description felt not like information being delivered from outside, but like a recognition of something you have always quietly known, leave a word in the comments below that names the season or the quality that felt most like coming home to yourself. Because sometimes naming what has always been quietly true is the first and most necessary act of genuinely living from it. And if you are ready to continue this journey inward, to keep working at the living frontier between what you already know yourself to be and what you are still in the process of becoming, stay close to this work, not in order to become a better version of yourself for the world's approval, but in order to stop losing yourself within the world's demands and to find, underneath all the noise, the particular and irreplaceable rhythm of who you have always, from the very first season of your life, most essentially been. There is something that needs to be said more plainly about what it actually feels like to discover the seasonal imprint in yourself. It is rarely a sudden revelation. It is rarely a moment of dramatic awakening in which everything becomes clear and the entire shape of your life is suddenly perfectly legible. It is more often a very quiet and gradual recognition, something closer to remembering than to learning, a sense that the description you have just encountered is describing not something new, but something you have always already known in the body, in the felt sense of your experience, in the recurring textures and recurring difficulties and recurring sources of unexpected aliveness that have threaded through your life from the very beginning. This is, in fact, exactly what Jung would have predicted. The deepest truths about a person's psychological life are almost never entirely unknown to them. They are rather unacknowledged. They are present but unnamed. They operate as the underlying current of experience without ever being explicitly recognized as influences. They are felt as simply the way things are, as the unexamined furniture of the inner life, so familiar that they have become effectively invisible. The practice of individuation, which is Jung's word for the lifelong work of becoming more fully yourself, is in large part a practice of making the invisible visible, of giving language and recognition to what has always already been operating beneath the surface of conscious awareness, of developing the capacity to observe your own patterns from enough of a distance that you can begin to work with them, rather than being simply lived by them, unconsciously, without choice. The birth season framework is not meant to replace that deeper and more personal work. It is meant to serve it, to offer a first point of recognition, a first moment of seeing a pattern that may have always seemed like simple personal reality, but is in fact a particular and understandable orientation with both gifts and shadows that can be consciously explored and consciously developed over the course of a life. What Jung discovered in his own process, which he described in his extraordinary autobiography Memories, Dreams, Reflections, was that this work of making the unconscious visible is not comfortable. It requires a willingness to see things in yourself that you would prefer not to see. It requires a kind of honesty about your own patterns that is not the self-criticism that many people are familiar with, not the harsh internal voice that tells you what you are doing wrong and how you fall short, but something quite different. Something more like a clear and compassionate witnessing of what is actually true, without the need to condemn it or immediately fix it, but simply to know it as it is. When you can witness your patterns in this way, when you can see clearly that your winter-born depth sometimes becomes a wall that keeps warmth at a distance, or that your spring-born love of beginning sometimes becomes a flight from the commitment that would allow something to fully mature, or that your summer-born ease with presence sometimes becomes a way of avoiding the interior work that demands withdrawal, or that your autumn-born awareness of impermanence sometimes becomes a preemptive grief that diminishes the fullness of the present. When you can see these things clearly and compassionately, something becomes possible that was not possible before. Not the elimination of the pattern, not the overnight transformation into someone who no longer struggles with it, but a genuine expansion of choice, a real, practical, felt sense that the pattern is not you in your entirety but one dimension of you, one that you can begin to work with, to develop around, to complement with capacities that were previously underdeveloped. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about the goal of the psychological life as the enlargement of consciousness, not the achievement of perfection, not the elimination of shadow, not the transcendence of difficulty, but the genuine, earned, experiential expansion of what you are able to be aware of, in yourself and in the world, and therefore of what you are able to consciously choose rather than unconsciously enact. Your birth season gave you a particular starting point in that process, a particular set of natural capacities, and a particular set of natural blind spots. The work of your life, the genuinely interesting and genuinely worthwhile work that runs underneath all the other work you do in the world, is the patient and ongoing, and never quite finished labor of bringing more of yourself into the light of awareness, of allowing what was given by the season to be honored without being turned into a limit, of discovering, through genuine experience rather than theory, that the person you are becoming is not smaller than the person you were born but larger, more whole, more capable of meeting the full range of what life will bring, more genuinely yourself than you have ever previously been, because more of yourself is now known, acknowledged, integrated, and available. This is the promise that lies at the heart of Carl Jung's life work. Not that psychology can save you from the difficulty of being human, not that self-knowledge can spare you from the inevitable losses and confusions and moments of genuine darkness that belong to every human life without exception, but that the life that is lived with increasing awareness and increasing honesty and increasing willingness to hold what is difficult alongside what is beautiful is a genuinely richer and more fully inhabited life than the one lived in unconscious reaction to patterns whose origins have never been examined and whose gifts have never been fully received. The season of your birth is where your story begins. What you do with what that season gave you is what your story becomes. There is one more thing worth saying before we close, something that is easy to miss when we talk about psychological imprints and seasonal influences and the deep structures of the unconscious. All of this, every idea we have explored together, every framework we have used to look more clearly at the invisible patterns running through a human life, exists for one purpose only: not to give you a more accurate theory of yourself, not to provide you with a more sophisticated language for explaining your patterns to other people, but to help you actually live better, more honestly, more fully, more in alignment with what is most essentially and irreducibly yours. Jung was not a theorist in the purely academic sense. He was a clinician, a man who spent decades sitting with people who were suffering, people who had lost the thread of their own lives, people who had wandered so far from their own center that they could no longer recognize themselves in the lives they were living. And what he observed, in case after case, decade after decade, was that the path back to the center was always the same path, even when the specific content of each person's journey was entirely unique. The path was always the one that moved toward greater consciousness, greater honesty, greater willingness to look at what had been unseen, to acknowledge what had been denied, to integrate what had been excluded. The birth season is one part of what has perhaps been unseen, one layer of the early imprinting that shapes the particular texture of your inner life in ways you may have always felt but never had a framework for understanding. Understanding it does not solve anything by itself. Knowledge of the pattern is not the same as the lived experience of working with the pattern over time, through practice and patience and the willingness to remain in relationship with yourself, even when what you are discovering is difficult or uncomfortable or genuinely surprising. But understanding it is where the possibility of something different begins. Every journey of genuine psychological change starts with a moment of recognition. A moment when something that was operating invisibly becomes, for the first time, visible enough to be named, visible enough to be questioned, visible enough to be worked with rather than simply lived by. If this conversation has offered you even a small piece of that kind of recognition, something genuine and worthwhile has happened here. Not because you now have a new label for yourself, but because you have, perhaps, caught a glimpse of a pattern that has been shaping your experience for longer than you have been aware. And in that glimpse, however brief and however partial, lies the beginning of a different and more conscious relationship with who you are and who you are becoming. Jung believed that this kind of consciousness, slowly and honestly earned through the genuine engagement with your own depths, is among the most valuable things a human life can produce. Not because it makes life easier or more comfortable or more socially successful, though it often, over time, does all of these things as well, but because it makes life more real, more genuinely inhabited, more fully yours, more worth the particular difficulty of being you, with all the gifts and all the shadows and all the unlived possibilities that your specific, seasonal, irreplaceable human self contains. The world you were born into in that particular month of that particular year received you into a specific and unrepeatable quality of light and temperature and seasonal atmosphere, and something in that receiving became, quietly and permanently, a part of who you are. Honor it, understand it, work with it honestly, and let it be as Jung always believed it could be, not a limit but a beginning. And if you find yourself returning to this video, not because you have forgotten what was said, but because something in the saying itself carries a quality you want to stay near, that too is meaningful. Jung believed that the things we are drawn to return to are rarely things we simply enjoy. They are usually things that are pointing towards something in us that is still in the process of being understood. Something that recognizes itself in what it encounters, even before the conscious mind has caught up with the recognition. The season of your birth is yours. The imprint it left is yours. The gifts it gave you, the shadows it created, the particular shape of longing and capability and difficulty that has threaded through your life from its very first days. All of this belongs to you in a way that nothing else quite does. It was given before you could choose, before you could refuse, before you had any relationship to choice at all, and that makes it, in a sense, the most intimate thing there is, the most foundational, the most original, the closest thing you have to a beginning that was entirely your own, before the world had yet begun the long and complicated and necessary and sometimes distorting work of telling you who you were supposed to become. Return to it. Return to the season. Return to the particular atmosphere that first received you. Not as an escape from the complexity of the person you have become, through all the years and all the experiences and all the choosing and refusing and learning that have followed, but as a way of remembering something true that was present before any of that complexity began. Something simple and foundational and entirely yours, the quality of the air when you first arrived, the particular angle of the light, the temperature of the world that first held you. That beginning is still in you. It has never left. And understanding it, truly and deeply, and with genuine compassion for both its gifts and its limitations, is one of the most honest acts of self-knowledge available to you. One of the quietest, one of the most necessary, one of the most genuinely worthwhile things you can do with the particular and unrepeatable life that, in the particular and unrepeatable season of your arrival, you were given.